Something extraordinary just happened in Melbourne. The very first race of the 2026 Formula One season, and one team didn't just win. They dominated. Pole position, fastest pace, perfect strategy, and a crushing 1-2 finish that left the rest of the grid asking the same question. How did Mercedes suddenly become this fast? George Russell controlled the race from the front. Kimi Antonelli followed him home. Ferrari could not match the pace. Red Bull finished almost a minute behind. And inside the paddock, engineers are already studying the data because some believe Mercedes may have discovered something hidden inside the new power unit regulations. Not just a faster car. A technical advantage that could change the entire 2026 championship before it has even begun. Some analysts are already talking about a possible 30 horsepower advantage. Others believe the real secret is in how Mercedes deploys electrical energy out of corners, something that looked almost unstoppable in Melbourne. But here is the detail most people completely missed. Several rival teams are now quietly pushing the FIA to take a closer look at the Mercedes power unit. Which means the first race of the season may have just triggered the first technical controversy of the new era. And once you see the data from Melbourne, you'll understand why the entire paddock is suddenly paying very close attention to Mercedes. Before we break down the evidence, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because what happens in the next few races could decide the championship much earlier than anyone expected. The first race of a new Formula One era always reveals something important. Not everything, but enough clues to understand where the real power lies. And Melbourne revealed something that immediately made engineers across the paddock uncomfortable. Because from the moment the cars touched the track on Friday, the Mercedes looked different. Not visually. Performance-wise. During the early practice sessions, most teams were still trying to understand the behavior of the new 2026 power units. These engines are completely different from the previous generation. More electrical energy. Less traditional combustion power. Much more dependence on how efficiently the hybrid system is deployed. Which means one thing. If a team understands energy management better than the others, the advantage can be enormous. And that is exactly what many engineers believe Mercedes may have achieved. On Friday, George Russell began showing the first signs of it. His laps looked calm, controlled, almost effortless. While other drivers struggled with rear traction exiting the slow corners of Albert Park, the Mercedes simply launched forward. The acceleration looked smooth. No wheel spin. No instability. Just clean traction. At first, many teams assumed it was simply a light fuel run. But then the third practice session arrived. And Russell delivered a lap that forced everyone to start paying attention. 1 minute 19 seconds and 53 thousandths. More than 6/10 faster than the closest Ferrari. In modern Formula One, that kind of gap in practice is rare. But the real shock came one day later. Qualifying. Because this is where teams finally remove the limits. Maximum power. Maximum electrical deployment. Everything the car can give in a single lap. And suddenly the Mercedes W17 looked even stronger. Russell pushed through the final sector of Albert Park with incredible stability. The car rotated perfectly through the medium-speed corners. And the exit traction out of the last corner was something other teams simply could not match. Then the timing screen updated. Pole position. And the gap behind him immediately told the whole story. Ferrari, 8/10 slower. 8/10. For a team expected to fight for the championship, that number felt alarming. Inside the Ferrari garage, engineers began studying the telemetry almost immediately. Because the deficit was not coming from one single corner. It was happening everywhere. On corner exit. On short straights. Even during the transition between braking and acceleration. Which points directly to one specific area of performance. Energy deployment. The way the hybrid system releases power through the lap. Charles Leclerc later admitted something that confirmed what the data was already suggesting. Mercedes had found a huge amount of performance in the engine. Not just small improvements. A big step. And according to Leclerc, even if Ferrari executed the perfect lap, they still would not have matched Russell's time. That is the kind of statement drivers rarely make publicly. Because it reveals something uncomfortable. A performance gap that cannot be solved overnight. But qualifying was only the first warning sign. Because what happened on Sunday made the situation look even more serious. And the moment the race started, something unexpected almost changed the entire story. When the lights went out in Melbourne, the race almost told a completely different story. Because both Mercedes drivers made a mistake. George Russell hesitated for a fraction of a second. Kimi Antonelli reacted even slower. And in Formula One, a fraction of a second at the start can change everything. Charles Leclerc launched perfectly from the second row. By the time the cars reached the first corner, the Ferrari was already ahead. For a moment, the Australian Grand Prix looked like it might turn into a Ferrari victory. Russell suddenly found himself trapped. A Ferrari ahead. Another Ferrari behind. Lewis Hamilton closing in. And this is where the new 2026 regulations started to show their true impact. Because overtaking in this new era works very differently. The new attack system allows drivers to deploy extra electrical power for short bursts. But every burst drains the battery faster. Which means every overtake attempt comes with a price. Russell experienced that immediately. Each time he activated the attack mode to challenge Leclerc, the Mercedes surged forward with incredible acceleration. But seconds later, the energy level dropped. And that allowed Leclerc to counterattack. Overtake. Counterattack. Then another overtake. For several laps the lead of the race kept changing between the Ferrari and the Mercedes. It was intense. And for a brief moment, it looked like Ferrari had the pace to fight for the win. But then the race produced the moment that quietly changed everything. A Red Bull suddenly slowed on track with a mechanical problem. The car pulled over. And the virtual safety car was deployed. Now here is where things get interesting. Because the decision that followed revealed something important about Mercedes this season. Not just speed. Clarity. While several teams hesitated, Mercedes reacted instantly. Both cars entered the pit lane at the same time. A perfectly synchronized double pit stop. Fresh tires. Minimal time lost under the virtual safety car. Ferrari made a different choice. They stayed out on track. Their strategy was based on probability. Albert Park often produces multiple interruptions. They believed another safety car would appear later in the race. But that calculation carried risk. And within seconds, the race order changed. Russell rejoined the circuit with clean air ahead of him. No Ferrari blocking his pace anymore. No pressure from behind. Just open track. And that is the moment when the real pace of the Mercedes became impossible to ignore. Lap after lap, Russell began controlling the race. Not attacking. Not pushing aggressively. Simply managing the gap. Which is often the clearest sign of a dominant car. Because when a driver can control the race without driving at the limit, it means the performance margin is real. Meanwhile, Kimi Antonelli was dealing with his own recovery mission. Only hours earlier, during the final practice session, he had experienced one of the biggest moments of the weekend. Exiting turn 2, the rear of the Mercedes suddenly snapped. The car spun violently and slammed into the barriers. It was a heavy impact. The kind of crash that normally ruins the rest of the weekend. But Antonelli climbed out of the car unharmed. And the Mercedes mechanics performed an incredible repair job before qualifying. What happened next surprised almost everyone. Antonelli returned in qualifying and placed the car on the front row. Second place. Just a few tenths behind Russell. An impressive response under pressure. But his race start dropped him all the way down to 7th place. Which meant he had a long way to recover. Yet something became clear as the race unfolded. Whenever Antonelli attacked another car, the Mercedes had a clear advantage on acceleration. Especially out of slow corners. Cars that defended aggressively for several laps eventually had to give up the position. The W17 simply had stronger exit speed. And that detail matters more than it first appears. Because Albert Park is not a power circuit like Monza. It is a traction circuit. Acceleration zones are short. Which means raw horsepower alone cannot explain the advantage. Something else was happening. Something related to how the Mercedes power unit delivered its energy. By the middle of the race, Antonelli had already climbed back into podium contention. And when the second virtual safety car appeared later in the race, Ferrari repeated the same strategic gamble. They stayed out again. Mercedes did not panic. They stayed with their plan. And when Ferrari finally stopped for fresh tires later in the race, the gap had already grown too large. Russell controlled the lead. Antonelli secured second place. And suddenly the result looked inevitable. A Mercedes 1-2 finish in the very first race of the new era. But what really shocked analysts after the race was not the strategy. And it was not the race management. It was the data coming from the telemetry. Because when engineers started comparing acceleration traces between the Mercedes and its rivals, one specific pattern kept appearing again and again. And that pattern may explain why rival teams are now asking the FIA to take a much closer look at the Mercedes power unit. But the real story of Melbourne did not appear on television. It appeared in the data. Because after the race, engineers from several teams began analyzing the telemetry from Albert Park. Acceleration traces, energy deployment curves, battery recovery cycles. And one pattern kept appearing again and again. Every time the Mercedes exited a slow corner, it accelerated earlier than the others. Not by a huge margin, but consistently. Corner after corner. Lap after lap. That consistency is what caught attention inside the paddock. Because in the new 2026 regulations, the balance between electrical energy and combustion power is extremely delicate. Teams have to decide exactly when the hybrid system releases its power. Too early, and the battery drains quickly. Too late, and the car loses acceleration when traction matters most. Most teams are still learning how to manage that balance. Mercedes, however, looked completely comfortable with it from the very first race. Which is why several analysts started asking a very specific question. Did Mercedes simply optimize their hybrid deployment better than everyone else? Or did they discover something deeper inside the regulations? Because rumors about the Mercedes power unit had already been circulating months before the season began. Inside the paddock, engineers were whispering about a possible breakthrough at Brixworth, the facility where Mercedes builds its power units. Some believed the new M17 engine had found a way to combine electrical deployment and combustion efficiency more effectively than its rivals. Not just more power. Smarter power. Power delivered exactly when the driver needs it most. Albert Park exposed that advantage perfectly. Short bursts of acceleration. Frequent traction zones. Rapid changes between braking and throttle. In those conditions, the Mercedes looked incredibly efficient. And that is why some engineers began estimating the advantage could be close to 30 horsepower compared to certain competitors. 30 horsepower in Formula One is enormous. It does not just help on the straights. It helps drivers exit corners faster. It helps during overtaking battles. It helps with tire management because the driver does not need to push as aggressively to maintain pace. And that combination explains why Russell looked so calm while controlling the race from the front. But this is where the situation becomes even more interesting. Because several teams believe the advantage might not come purely from raw engine power. Instead, they suspect something related to how Mercedes manages compression ratios and hybrid energy deployment within the new regulations. A small technical interpretation. A clever engineering solution. Possibly even a regulatory loophole. Nothing illegal has been proven. But when rival teams begin asking technical questions to the FIA, it usually means something unusual has been discovered. And according to several paddock insiders, that process has already started quietly after the Australian Grand Prix. Teams are studying every frame of data from Melbourne. Looking at throttle application. Looking at battery discharge rates. Looking at how the Mercedes deploys power out of corners. Because if one team has truly unlocked a hidden advantage inside the 2026 regulations, the entire competitive order of the championship could change. And that possibility explains why the reaction from Ferrari after the race sounded unusually direct. Charles Leclerc admitted that Ferrari started the season significantly behind Mercedes in terms of performance. Not slightly behind. Significantly behind. Which is not the kind of statement drivers normally make after the first race. Lewis Hamilton delivered a similar message.